Hello and welcome to my channel where I discuss fantasy Formula 1. Today is not one of my usual videos where I discuss my team for an upcoming race week, but rather I thought we would go through each of the chips provided to us by Fantasy Formula 1 and discuss when the optimal time to use them are. A good chip strategy is key to get the most out of your season and get a high result at the end, and you definitely do not want to do what many people at the top of the leaderboards currently have done, which is blow your chips early. So we're going to go through each of them, talk about what my personal strategy for them will be, but also different strategies you can use over the course of the season, and clear up some confusion about how some of them work. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So the first chip we're going to talk about is the most powerful one. It is the Limitless Chip, and it is the first chip you see on your top left when you click that Apply Chip button. And it is so tempting to click it every week, but as with every chip in the game, you only get one per season, so it is important that you use it at the right time. Now, when you use your Limitless Chip before a deadline, you get unlimited transfers and an unlimited budget for that race week, but your team reverts back to what it was prior to that race week after the race week has ended. And it is your old team that is subject to price changes. So say you have a lot of cheap drivers in your lineup that you probably won't have on the Limitless. It is their value that is going to be applied to your team after the weekend. It is not the expensive drivers that you have for that weekend. Another important thing to note is that if you make a transfer and then apply your Limitless Chip and then start making crazy transfers, that first transfer that you made before the Limitless Chip is also not going to save. Your team reverts back to what it was the prior race weekend. It does not take into account transfers that you made that week before you activated the Limitless Chip. So you essentially throw away any saved transfer that you have by activating the Limitless Chip. So I think it goes without saying that you should use your Limitless Chip during a sprint weekend, right? Because you get this unique opportunity to pick up all of the top drivers that score the most points every week, and you get to pick them during a week in which they have 2 more instances to get those high points, right? When there's a sprint weekend, there's a sprint qualifying where they can get points from, and there's a sprint race where they can get points from. So obviously you want to use the chip where you get more points when the drivers that you bring in are going to score the most points. I feel like that's kind of obvious. Now, the same will apply for a couple of the other chips as well. I put the sprint calendar here above me for the 2024 season. We have China, which is coming up pretty soon. Miami is a back-to-back sprints. Then Austria in the summer. And then all the way in October and November and December, we have Austin, Sao Paulo, and Qatar Lusail. Now, which sprint should you use which chip on? That's where it gets more interesting. And what I would personally prefer, or this is at least what my strategy is going to be, is to try and apply the Limitless Chip in a weekend where there are more likely to be overtakes, right? Because if your drivers do overtake, your good drivers that you can have all at once, you want to have them when they're going to do overtakes. And I've looked at a bit of overtaking data, not just from last season, but over the course of the last couple of years. And looking at the sprint races we have at our disposal for the 2024 season, I'm already ruling out a few of them. The first one I'm ruling out is the first one. I would not use my Limitless Chip in China. It was simply too long ago we had a race in China to where we don't know how these cars work on that track. So I would avoid China for that reason, because we cannot predict how that race is going to turn out. I would also avoid Qatar. Qatar in general do not have that many overtakes in the past couple of years, at least not when compared to the likes of Sao Paulo, Austin, Spielberg, and also actually Miami last season had a lot of overtakes. So I would be considering using the Limitless Chip and the other chips that also require, I would say, sprint weekends. I would limit them to the four races in the middle here. Either Miami, Austria, USA, Austin, or Brazil, Sao Paulo. Now, another thing to note is that you might want to use something like the Limitless Chip a bit earlier in the season. Now, why is that? Well, we, as good managers, do a lot of work to increase our team value. And we saw this especially at the end of last season, that our team values were very, very inflated, which meant we could afford very, very expensive teams with a lot of top drivers. So if you can already afford a near perfect team, especially at the end of last season when you could have double Red Bull, double McLaren, triple Red Bull, triple McLaren, and then just one of the low cost. I mean, yes, you could fit in, a Leclerc, a Sainz, and Hamilton, but I mean, trading out a Sainz or a Leclerc for a Oscar Piastri at the end of last season was not ideal. So using your Limitless Chip when it looks like the field is more even and you definitely do not have the budget to get the best team might be the best option, or at least the option that gets you the most points compared to what other managers do, right? Because say you save your Limitless Chip until Sao Paulo, when it's that late in the season, perhaps it's, you have a much larger budget, and perhaps it's super clear that Red Bull and Ferrari are the only teams that are going to get high points. Mercedes, McLaren, Aston Martin, they don't even get close to Ferrari or Red Bull this season. And after your team value has increased, you might be sitting with Red Bull, Ferrari as both your constructors. You have Max Verstappen, you can maybe even afford one of the Ferrari drivers. At that point, you're limitless chipping to add 3 more drivers to your lineup. Whereas if you use your limitless chip in Miami or Austria, for example, at that point you might not even be able to afford the Ferrari, Red Bull, Verstappen combo, and never mind having a second expensive driver on top of that. So if you use your limitless chip early in the season when budget is tighter on one of the first sprint races, you're going to be able to fit in more of the heavy hitters than the non-limitless chip users when you compare them, in Brazil and Miami. Your limitless team in Miami is going to be way different from the non-limitless users, but in Brazil, for example, your limitless team could be way more even in terms to the non-limitless users. So that is something to consider, and that is personally what I'm going to be going for. Now, if it is Miami, or if it's going to be Miami, I don't know. It also depends a bit on the weather. Miami is usually a rather safe one to predict in terms of weather. If it's looking like a rainy one, it could be really good, such as, the Dutch Grand Prix last season at Zandvoort, when the rain created chaos and there was a lot of overtakes, I think record-breaking many. But it could also create more chaos in that your drivers DNF, right? So you do also want to be careful with that. So personally, I'm looking at Miami or Austria for my limitless chip. Let me know down below which one of them two, or if there's another of the sprint races that you are considering for your limitless chip. Next up is the classic wildcard, and this chip has actually gotten more powerful this season in a sort of sneaky way. So what does a wildcard do? Well, you get unlimited transfers. You just gotta stay within your budget, right? And this season it is more powerful because using a transfer that is not free now costs you 10 points, whereas previously it was only 4. So using your wildcard at the correct time is more important now than before, because previously, if you used your wildcard early and then needed a wildcard later, it was not the end of the world to make 2 extra transfers and take a -8. It wouldn't make or break your season. Taking a -20 in a race week, that hurts. So, you want to use your wildcard at the right spot. But that right spot could be anywhere. The wildcard is actually not as obvious when you compare it to the other chips about when to use it. Because we only have 7 assets in our teams, right? We have 5 drivers and 2 constructors. If you only do 1 transfer in a race, you can bring 1 transfer over and have 3 free transfers for the next race. And 3 free transfers is a lot. It's nearly 50% of your team, and I would even say that it's enough to do larger restructurings in your team. So because of that, the wildcard is not as needed, and you can still be quite, daring with your wildcard when to use it. So what I would say, if you're sitting there right now preparing for the Australian Grand Prix, which is when I'm recording this, and you're looking at your team and it's a disaster. You picked bad drivers, bad constructors to start the season. You don't have any Red Bull assets. All your assets are plummeting in price. You want to catch price rises, but you can't. Use it now. The worst case is that just later on in the season, you might have to be a bit more careful. Maybe not take that, that extra 1 transfer that you want in a week and save 1 transfer, so that going into the next week you will have 3, and you can do a lot of the restructuring that you need over the course of the season. So if you need to use it now, don't be afraid to use it. Use it now to get ahead of the curve if your team is bad, right? But if your team is looking good and you can get around the Australian Grand Prix and, the ones that are coming up with just your free transfers, the 2 instances that I would look to use my wildcard on is either when a team comes with large upgrades or just a general big performance increase. For example, the best example is McLaren last year, when suddenly they came with a large update to the car and suddenly they were the second best team on the grid for the second half of the season, pretty much. Things like that could make you want to make larger restructurings to your team. So that is one possibility to use it. The other one is when a race has a lot of penalties. You're sitting there with one or 2 big drivers or constructors, and then you see that before the race weekend begins, you hear that many of them, or many teams, are taking engine penalties, right? When they take penalties, they're going to qualify in a decent spot and then get moved back. And when they get moved back, if they're fast, they're going to be able to move through the back markers and get a lot of overtake points. So you might want to do a larger restructuring if you can time it with a race where a lot of teams are taking these penalties. Or you could do the opposite. If a lot of people are taking penalties on a track that is not that easy to overtake, now that usually doesn't happen, but then you could get some of the teams in that are not going to take penalties. But usually you want to take the teams that have the penalties, especially the faster teams, right? So that is the wildcard. It is a bit of a simpler one in what it does compared to the Limitless. It is not as powerful as the Limitless, but it's more complicated, and when you use it, you have to find when it's right for your team specifically, and that might be right now. The most interesting chip we have at our disposal is the Final Fix chip, and the reason for that is because you do not use it during the actual planning phase leading up to a race weekend, but rather during the weekend itself after the deadline. In a normal race weekend, it would be after qualifying. In a sprint weekend, it could be after the sprint qualifying, after the sprint, or after the regular qualifying. What the Final Fix chip does is that it replaces one of your drivers, not constructors, during the race weekend for another driver, within your team budget, of course. Now, using it in a normal weekend, you use it after qualifying, and you will have a different driver for the race. During a sprint weekend, you can use it after any instance, either after sprint qualifying, after the sprint, or after the regular qualifying, and then the driver you bring in will be the one you get points from for the remainder, for the remaining sessions, right? After the race week is done, your team reverts back to what it was before you used the Final Fix chip, which means you will get the driver that you transferred out back. Now, the driver that you transferred out, you still get their points for the session you had them in. So if you had X driver in qualifying and then use Final Fix to bring in the driver Y, you will get driver X's points in the qualifying and driver Y's points in the race. It's all well and good, but when do you want to use it? Well, the classic way of using it is when one of the elite drivers in the faster cars start from the back. Why? Well, because of how the points system work, they will probably, if they're in a fast car on a race where overtaking is possible, get a lot of positions gained and a lot of overtakes, which can give them a much higher score compared to someone starting in P2, P3, P4, right? Another reason why it's so powerful to do this strategy is because right now many of our teams are structured in such a way where we have 2 elite constructors and 1 elite driver, and that elite driver is usually the driver that gets the DRS boost. So if you transfer out the driver with the DRS boost on, the new driver will get the DRS boost. So you can get a pretty big score doing this if say you have Max Verstappen as your DRS boost and then Checo bins it in qualifying. You can final fix Max Verstappen out for Checo, get Max Verstappen's pole position points, and then you get Checo's massive haul and maybe driver of the day if he brings it from P20 to P2 during the actual race. So that is a classic way of using it. Another way you can use it is actually by taking one of your backmarker cheap drivers out that got very lucky or was very good in qualifying and ended up very high on the grid, and you're scared that they're gonna drop back like a rock. One great example of this is actually in Sao Paulo, Brazil 2022, where Kevin Magnussen put it on pole in the sprint race qualifying. Now that was a sprint race, so the race distance was shorter, but he dropped down from P1 down to P8, and if it had been a full feature length race, he probably would have dropped further. Just that position drop is -8. Now I don't remember how many overtakes he got, but if he were to drop down further in a feature race and end up P12, P13 even, would he have gotten a driver of the day for that? Probably not. So we're looking at a pretty decent negative score for the driver, whereas you could final fix him out for one of the other cheap drivers that are starting from the back and, you know, get a 20-point swing. Now, this is not a conventional way of using it. It's not the way I am looking to use my final fix chip. But maybe that opportunity arises, right? Maybe, God forbid, Shogun Yu puts it on pole in that kick that has the worst race pace, and I'm just expecting him to fall back 15 places in the race or even DNF. Well, I can sell him after I get this qualifying, his nice 10-point qualifying haul, and get another one of the cheaper drivers in. And that's sort of the way with the final fix. Yes, you can go into the season with a plan on how to use it, but you don't really know when the opportunity is going to arise, so you have to be alert with the final fix chip. For the Limitless chip, I know I'm going to use it in a sprint race. I just have to wait and see which sprint race feels right. The final fix could happen in any week, and that's kind of what makes it exciting. The next chip we're going to talk about is the Autopilot chip. The Autopilot chip is very simple. You select it before the race weekend begins, before the deadline. And then your DRS boost that you place every weekend on Max Verstappen is going to automatically switch to the highest scoring driver once the race weekend has concluded. Well, it might seem obvious, yes, I should use it when I don't know who to place my DRS boost on, but usually, at least early on in the season right now, you should have a team structure of 2 premium constructors and 1 premium driver. And when you only have 1 premium driver, there is no reason to use the autopilot because the odds of one of your back markers outscoring that one driver unless they DNF is very low. So the main point of the season when you should use your autopilot chip is when you think one premium driver could outscore another. Now this then concludes to my next point, which is that this chip is better used later on in the season. Why? Well, because our teams will be more expensive, hopefully, with the increases in prices happening all the time and accumulating throughout the season, getting our team value up to crazy heights at the end. When our team value is up, we can have more expensive drivers in, which makes it more difficult to predict which one of them is going to outperform any of the others in a specific week. Now, when am I planning to use this chip? Well, I haven't actually written it out here, but I also think you should use this during a sprint weekend. Why? Well, for the same reason. There are more instances when your premium drivers can score big points. So there's also a bigger chance, or bigger risk rather, that one of those premium drivers DNFs in one of the two races and gets a big minus, or that they just perform better in one of the two and get the more points than the one that you had planned to put the DRS boost on. So personally, I'm saving the autopilot for one of the later sprint races, perhaps Brazil, since it can definitely rain there sometimes. So yeah, autopilot, simple enough. Save it until you have expensive drivers that could outscore each other in any given race week. Now, next up is the no negative, and this is the one that has changed the most from last season. What this does is that you activate it before the deadline, and it removes negative points per scoring category. Previously, it removed negative points in total, but now it's a bit more powerful, as it applies per scoring category rather than just their overall point score. So I took Shogun Yu's performance in Saudi Arabia as an example. The different scoring categories that you can see are the four that are shown there: the race position, the qualifying result, the race positions gained, and the overtake bonus. Now in a sprint, there are more categories, obviously. So again, this chip is now even better in sprint races. The previous way to use it was during rainy races when you were expecting a lot of DNFs, because that was the main way that a driver was actually going to get a big negative total score. But now it might be better to use it during sprint races. Whereas previously it was really, really bad to use it during sprint races because, well, if they got negative points for DNFing in the sprint and then got positive points in the actual race, they could have just ended up on a positive score overall, and the no negative chip was useless. But now, during sprint races, it's actually very, very good to be able to apply that no negative so that you can avoid those DNFs in the sprint or in the race, since, you know, it's two races and twice the likelihood of a DNF. But yeah, the difference is essentially that previously, Shogun Yu in Saudi Arabia would have ended on 0 points and saving me 2 points, whereas the new version would have removed that -5, so Shogun Yu would have actually ended up on 3 points, saving me 5 total. So yeah, that's the no negative chip. Again, similar to the DRS boost, I'm looking to use it on a later sprint race, or if there's one race that looks to be complete and utter chaos with the rain. But again, probably a sprint race. And last but certainly not least, we have the extra DRS, the triple DRS boost, everyone's probably favorite chip, although it is less powerful than the Limitless one. Similarly to previously, you want to use this during a sprint race. Obviously, I've jokingly put Max Verstappen during a sprint weekend. Well, the reason for that is you really need to trust this driver to not DNF, and the driver currently never DNFing is Max Verstappen. This chip gives you a 3 times point boost and your regular 2 times point boost, so you also want to use the triple DRS when you have 2 premium drivers, which again is probably later on in the season because you don't want to go without those 2 premium constructors currently, if the game keeps going in the direction it has been going this 2024 season. So yeah, Max Verstappen during a sprint weekend is definitely the point where you want to use the triple DRS boost. Now let's quickly go over to a little overview of when you want to use each of them. So something like this is looking to be my preliminary strategy for the 2024 season in terms of my chips. As you can see here, I've placed the Limitless Chip on Austria Spielberg. That could just as well be Miami. It could be either of the two. And then the extra DRS, the no negative, and the Autopilot Chip are reserved for the 3 later sprints in the season, for the reasons that I discussed previously. And then we have the final fix and the wildcard chip there as, you know, wild cards, I suppose, that can sort of be used whenever, and I need to be proactive in how I approach using them. One important thing to know that I did not mention at the start of the video is that you can only use 1 chip per weekend. So if you've used 1 chip, you can then not go and use another one, which means that you do have to space them out. You can't do Limitless and extra DRS in the same weekend, or else that would clearly be the best strategy. And the reasoning that I previously stated for extra DRS, no negative, and Autopilot for using them later in the season is also the reason why I think you need to use your Limitless chip on one of these earlier 2 sprint weekends. Again, I would avoid China since we don't know enough about it, and I wouldn't waste such a powerful chip, or I wouldn't bet such a powerful chip on such an unknown entity in the Shanghai Grand Prix. So for now, something like this is looking to be my strategy. The extra DRS, no negative, and Autopilot could be any of the 3, really. The reason I've put them in this order is that I put the extra DRS on Austin because, you know, Austin, it never rains, and I should probably have 2 premium drivers in my team at that point. And there's quite a decent amount, at least above average amount of overtakes there. Brazil, Sao Paulo, there's a lot of overtakes, but it might also rain, so I might want to save my no negative for then, or the Autopilot, and then Autopilot in Qatar then, when I also probably have 2 or 3 good drivers in my team that can score points. I do think no negative is stronger to use in Brazil because your back market drivers could DNF, and it's an increased chance that they will DNF, and since those DNF points in, you know, the race result or the sprint result will be removed entirely, and you will still get a positive point from whichever one they didn't crash in. No negative looks very powerful in something like a Brazil, if it's going to rain there, for avoiding those DNFs with your cheaper drivers. So yeah, this is my preliminary chip strategy. Again, preliminary chip strategy. Everything can change, but I will of course let you know whenever I am planning to use any of these chips, apart from maybe final fix, if that comes up very, very sudden, that one particular move looks good and I don't have time to make a video about it. But all the other 5 chips I will let you know when I use them, obviously, and also when I plan on using them if this plan were to change going forward. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you did, please comment below what your chip strategy, preliminary chip strategy, is looking like for this F1 fantasy season. If you have any other questions, or just or wondering why I've placed any of these chips in the positions that I have, please ask them. I will respond to any and all comments that I get, and I will be out with my team selection video for Australia at the usual time after free practice 2 on Saturday this time. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Peace.